And we're back on Fresh Waves. We're moving into our second hour here at Whistle FM, and we are now switching from invasive ghosts and goblins to invasive plant species and invasive bugs. And we're talking with Dayna Laxton from York Region, and she is an invasive species specialist. And you're supposed to say that 5 times fast. But it has to be like, at 7 o'clock in the morning. So let me see if you can manage it. Anyway, good morning, Dayna. Thank you for coming on the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is a hot topic for people who live in Witchart-Stouffville because we have so many tracts of the York Regional Forest in Witchart-Stouffville.
Right.
It almost seems like it's ours and ours alone. Although it isn't, but we know that the majority of it actually is. And we live, some of us, backing onto the forest or around the forest. Mm-hmm. And we also play in the forest. People go up and walk, and they walk their dogs, and they use the forest in recreational ways, mm-hmm. and attend events up there. And it's just a big part of Witchart-Stouffville. And I think in so much as we also need to be really aware of what an invasive plant is, what an invasive bug is, mm-hmm. we also need to be aware of how we contribute by planting things that we perhaps shouldn't be planting right against the forest. Or, in fact, my backyard is part of the forest. I can't say that it's not a part of the York Regional Forest. The only thing that identifies it as mine versus yours sort of thing is a fence. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's the same forest. The forest doesn't know that boundary. That's a human-made boundary.
Right.
So I think we all have a responsibility towards the forest and what we plant and what we make our gardens out of, so to speak.
100%, yep.
So that we can all be part of it. But we can't do that if we're not educated as to what we should and shouldn't do.
Right. So that's exactly right. A lot of the awareness and education that we try to do at York Region through a lot of our partners as well is to teach residents of York Region what is preferred and not preferred in terms of planting plants for your garden, because so many properties back onto ravines and natural areas such as the York Regional Forest, and people don't do it maliciously, they just don't know.
Yeah.
And so there's a number of awesome education programs and organizations out there that have put out booklets and pamphlets and tried to do awareness campaigns in local nurseries as well to try and say, hey, there's this popular plant that you might see in your neighbor's gardens, but it's actually pretty invasive, and here are some options. So the Ontario Invasive Plant Council is a fantastic resource. They have what's called their Grow Me Instead guide.
Oh, nice.
And so there's an entire guide that's made for Southern Ontario, and then there's one made for Northern Ontario. And it shows common ground covers, ornamental grasses, aquatic plants if you're somebody that has a pond on your property. And then they show some of the top invaders, so ones that would, if they could, or given the opportunity, could invade the natural areas. And then they say, here are 3 or 4 options that are available. And then they have their nursery recognition program that actually have a whole bunch of nurseries throughout Ontario that have signed on to this program that says we will only sell native, non-propagating plants in our nurseries. Therefore, we're not selling these invasive ones anymore. So it's a fantastic program.
That's really neat. So you can get good ideas of what to plant, as opposed to just knowing what not to plant.
Correct. So it does give you options, and so it's available as a PDF downloadable. And so again, if you Google Ontario Invasive Plant Council or Grow Me Instead guide, just make sure you get the Ontario version. Like I said, there's a Southern Ontario and a Northern Ontario, and that will give you a good idea as to some of the popular plants, like I said, to avoid, because they have been proven to be extremely invasive.
Okay, it's called the Ontario Invasive
Plant Council.
Plant Council. Are these people volunteers? Or?
So it is an NGO, nonprofit, based out of Peterborough. And
nice.
It's made up of a number of volunteer specialists in the field, a board of directors. So yeah, it's driven by a whole bunch of people that are very smart when it comes to plants.
Very educated, and that's a good thing. Okay, so I mean, from a lay person looking in, I remember when I first mentioned invasive plants to my kids, my daughter said, "Perfect, we can get rid of all the poison ivy." But poison ivy is a natural plant to this area, isn't it?
It is, correct. So it is native, and so it's not technically invasive. Is it a nuisance? Certainly.
Yes.
I am personally affected by poison ivy extremely easily, so I am not a fan. But it's got a niche in our forest ecosystem. It does like disturbance similar to invasive plants. That's one of the characteristics of invasive plants, is that they do well in disturbed ecosystems, poor soil, just overall not great habitat. So they're very adaptable. And so poison ivy is as well. So that's why you often see it along trail edges and things like that where we happen to go, because those are man-made trails, constant disturbance. The poison ivy's there.
That's true. Now, does the York Regional Forest cut down poison ivy or take it away, or they just leave it there?
We don't manage it. No, not specifically. There are some exceptions to that rule. In cases where we see it growing in the center of trails, as an example, which has happened, we will take it out, because our sort of key messaging to forest users is stay on the trail. But then if the poison ivy is on the trail, you know what I mean? So it's high risk that way. So we will take care of it when it's on the trail, in the center of the trails. But general rule is no, we do not actively control poison ivy.
There you go. Well, I guess it's not an invasive species.
It's not.
So do you control the invasive species that you see in the forest?
We do, and it's a tough job because there's over 2,300 hectares of York Regional Forest, and there are invasive plants that unfortunately are everywhere. So we can't control or stop or remove all of them.
All of them.
We have an internal sort of document that helps guide us, and it gives us a prioritization ranking as to where we should concentrate our control efforts. And that's usually around species at risk habitat, specific sensitive habitats that might be completely destroyed or lost if this plant were allowed to take over. So that's sort of one of our key prioritization
guidelines.
Methods. Yeah.
Okay, so some of these are just, they could be as simple as somebody planting a plant that was in their garden and the seeds blew into the forest, and all of a sudden
or even literally grew across the fence line into the forest, which I've seen examples of as well. Another common way that invasive plants will end up in our natural areas is through people tossing their garden waste over the fence. So if they're doing gardening, raking their lawn, pitching out potted plants that they no longer want, and they're dumping them into the natural areas instead of putting them in their yard waste pickup, curbside pickup, that's where we sometimes see things sprout out of their waste that they've dumped on the York Regional Forest property. And then it kind of takes off from there if we don't catch it soon enough.
Isn't that interesting? Because half the time you would think that if it's just dumped there, it's not going to grow anyway.
Yeah, no, I've seen lots of evidence of that, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Isn't that interesting? So what would be a common thing that you would see as an invasive plant in the forest?
We have way too much dog strangling vine. That is
dog strangling vine.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one that is very common in the York Regional Forest. It loves our pine plantations. So it likes that partial shade, and it does really well in sandy soils as well, which is what we have. It does.
I have a ton of this in my yard. I'm looking it up in the book to see what it looks like. I have a ton of it.
Yep.
And I yank it every year, and every spring it grows back, and it wraps itself around other things, even like it's
other plants.
Garden spruce. It looks like a spruce, but it's not. It's got softer needles. It's like a garden evergreen.
Yep.
And it gets completely wrapped, and when you start pulling it, you're just pulling it.
Oh, yeah.
Go on forever.
It's probably one of my top most hated plants. And unfortunately we have a ton of it in the York Regional Forest and in York Region as a whole. And so we try to control it as best we can, but like I said, it is so rampant that it's really difficult. But if you're a landowner that has it in your backyard, I highly recommend constant cutting. Don't pull, because all you're really doing is aggravating the root system, and the roots will just resprout because you won't ever get it all. So the key is to deplete the energy in the roots, and that means let it grow to the point where it has a flower or a seed pod that's green, and then cut it off.
Cut off the seed pod, or cut off the whole plant.
And if you can mow it, if you can whip or snip it, or you can get down on your hands and knees and hand cut it, If you're able to do that, and you do that consistently, not allowing the plants to go to seed, because that's key, then you should, within 3 to 5 years, be able to say, you know what, it's gone. It's persistence. When it comes to invasive plant management, it's 100% you have to be persistent and consistent.
Well, the one thing I'm finding that if I get down near the bottom and yank, I pull up some of the root.
Mm-hmm. You could probably get the root crown, but then there's probably still some pieces of root.
Oh, yeah, there is, because every year it grows back.
Right. And then the thing is they like that disturbance, like I said. So you just disturbed the soil, and now they're happy again. So you're even better off planting other things every time you remove some of it as well, to give that competition.
Because it's growing in and amongst other things.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to find the bottom of it to begin with, because it's in all this other foliage and big ferns that I don't want to.
So it sounds like you would have to do a little bit more of that precise cutting. Yeah.
All right.
But another key thing with this plant is that it actually changes the soil's chemistry. It's extra evil in that it has what's called an allelopathic potential. So it's actually changing and killing the mycorrhizae that are the beneficial organisms that kind of tag team on the root systems of our good plants. And so by altering the chemistry, it's killing off those mycorrhizae, and the other plants now are losing out on valuable nutrients. So then they kind of are more easily taken over by this plant.
That's fascinating. Plants are smarter than we think. Especially those nasty ones.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny to me every year when I see, I made a little vegetable garden, probably the size of this table, and I decided not to do it last year, and it is completely overgrown now. You can never tell that there was a vegetable garden ever there.
Right. Yep.
It's amazing how nature does that.
Yep.
It just takes over and does whatever it wants.
Yes, and invasive plants are sort of the masters at that, if you will, because they're given that edge up on our native species, because they have these defense mechanisms that they can use against our native species. And it really is kind of like a plant war, for lack of a better term, and they will win and they will take over.
Well, 10 years ago or 11 years ago when I moved in on Jesse Thompson, my dad walked by my backyard and said, if you don't get that stuff right now, your whole lawn will be covered in it. I said, I don't care. I don't want a manicured lawn. I just want a meadow. And he said, well, careful what kind of meadow you get. This stuff is everywhere. I think it's creeping Charlie. It goes along the ground and it's just small, and you start to pull it up and you can pull it for 10 minutes and you're still not at the end of it.
Yeah, that one is another weird one that I hear a lot of complaints from landowners on is how do I stop Creeping Charlie? What do I do? But honestly, Creeping Charlie is one of those many, many, many weeds that just seems to love grass lawns. If you don't have grass lawns, you don't have Creeping Charlie.
Right. It's nowhere else in the property because the rest of the property is forested.
Yep.
So it
has its niche. Yeah.
Well, I guess they all do, don't they? You know, if you talk to people who are avid vegetable growers, there's certain things that grow better in one spot than another spot, and these plants are no different.
Yep.
Okay, so what are your top contenders in the York Regional Forest other than dogwood?
Dog strangling vine?
Yes, dog strangling.
Garlic mustard is another one, and it has the same allelopathic capabilities of changing the soils.
People
chemistry.
eat that, though, don't they?
It is. So it came to North America because people in Europe were using it as an herb. It's called garlic mustard because it actually has that garlicky odor, but tastes kind of like a green onion mixed in as well. So like a chive or green onion. So it is completely edible. And that's how it came to North America. But again, because there's no natural predators, no bugs, no pathogens to sort of keep their populations in check, the garlic mustard is going wherever it wants, and it's changing that soil chemistry as it goes, making it more beneficial for itself, killing off its enemies, which is our native plants, and so that's how it's winning. So that's another one. We deal with a lot of buckthorn in the York Regional Forest as well.
What's buckthorn?
So European buckthorn and glossy buckthorn are two sort of shrubby trees that have been introduced to North America as well. And they are, again, allelopathic. So the roots do the same thing, change the soil. And they create a lot of juicy berries that the birds love. And the unfortunate part is, yes, that's great for the birds because they get to, stuff their faces with these juicy berries, but then they fly off and go poop somewhere, and those berries come out completely with viable seeds that then just transplant buckthorn everywhere else. And buckthorn is really good at making a complete thick monoculture thicket of itself, not allowing anything else to grow underneath it and overtaking young trees. And so that's sort of another one of those bad aspects of it, is that it just won't let anything else grow around it.
It's amazing how they can be so... Well, I guess if it was a plant that we liked, we'd be really happy that it had the ability to do this.
Right.
to grow everywhere.
But the thing is, I think the key thing with invasive plants is that you see that they create a monoculture of themselves, so just themselves. They've competed everything else, whereas we want a mix of things because all the insects and wildlife need a mix of things. And so some people liken when you have a whole patch of dog strangling vine or a whole forest just full of buckthorn, they liken that to, it might as well be a desert because there's almost no life there.
Yeah.
So we've lost our diversity because we've lost our insects. They're not feeding on these plants. That's another thing too, is not many things are feeding on these plants, and they're taking out the native herbs and plants and trees that our insects would otherwise be feeding on.
Right.
And insects feed the entire rest of the food chain. There's a significant proportion of the food chain. In fact, so many birds require insects that their nests will fail if they can't find enough worms or caterpillars or larvae for their young.
Well, that would make sense. And that's probably the part that people tend not to think of when they think of, oh yeah, but I just want to plant this because it's great ground cover. It has a nice little purple flower on it. And you plant one and it just takes over the whole garden. Then I don't have to garden and I don't have to worry about anything.
But it's not useful for anything else other than us looking at it. And so that's why we've sort of partnered with LEAF, Local Enhancement and Appreciation of Forests, as well as the region in May 2017 had signed the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. And what that means is that we're committing to promoting to our residents and encouraging and supporting programs that encourage pollinator-friendly and monarch-friendly gardening. And so this is bringing it back to diversity in your garden and planting native things that have a use for birds and insects and therefore the rest of the food web. And so LEAF is fantastic. They have garden kits. So it's easy peasy stuff for people who are like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't have a green thumb. You can say daisy. You could say whatever. This means nothing to me. And LEAF is so easy. If you visit leaf.org, they have these garden kits. Like I said, they break them into, like, there's an edible garden kit, there's a butterfly garden kit, there's a bird garden kit. So what that is they pick the plants for you. They give you a planting guide. You can do it yourself, or you can actually purchase and get it all planted by LEAF staff.
Really?
It's a full service program. Yep.
They'll come and plant my garden? Oh,
they will.
Nice?
Yes. And they'll give you aftercare instructions, and it's fantastic.
Wow, well, I'll have to contact them. I've got a little note here of some things that were written down before as good things that are like there is a butterfly weed apparently that's supposed to be a good plant for butterflies. Yeah,
so butterflies in general like big flowers that they can land on. So if you want to attract butterflies to your garden, plant big showy flowers. But also you have to be aware that some big showy flowers don't actually even have pollen, and the butterflies are looking for food. So you want to make sure that you're planting plants that have a pollen or a food source for the butterflies or insects. So butterfly weed it definitely attracts butterflies. But depending on the species of butterfly you want to attract, you can look up the types of plants that they actually either eat themselves, or that they're young, so their eggs need to hatch on. So that's why the monarch is endangered, because we had the common milkweed that was getting destroyed everywhere, so they couldn't find any places for their eggs to hatch. And so that was this whole big resurgence of plant milkweed, because the monarchs need the food source when they come back, when they migrate up from Mexico.
There were a ton of them this year. I've never seen so many monarchs. It must be cyclical because or something in the weather. I think
the difference is that we have taken common milkweed off of the noxious weed list years ago, and so we've allowed it to grow in so many more places that the monarchs are doing really well now.
Well, that's good, because it was a sad thing when they were such a rare sighting, and now they're just landing all over you at the cottage and and in the York Regional Forest. It's nice to see them back.
Yep.
Well, we've got to take a little break. You're listening to Fresh Waves. We have Dayna Laxton in the studio this morning. We're talking about invasive species. This is a very interesting topic, and one that I think you'll want to stay tuned to. We'll be right back.